Let me begin by saying how thankful we are to be back and how thankful we are to each and every one of you for the many kindnesses, the expressions of care and concern, especially your prayers for us over the last few weeks. We have also thankfully come through with all fairly mild cases, and we are especially thankful for your concern and prayers on our behalf as we are navigating changing circumstances with the little one here. And we are going to be making some difficult decisions over the next week or so, and we would continue to covet your prayers as we go through that process. Over the last several weeks, I had lessons planned, and I appreciate the fellows who filled in for me, and those who did so with some degree of notice, and those like Trevor who did so with like 3 days worth of notice. And I appreciate the efforts each one put in, and we were thankful to be able to follow along with those lessons from home. As we approach the end of the year, the final Sunday of the year 2020, I thought about just going along and just preaching whatever I was going to be preaching, but I've been planning for some time to take the last Sunday of the year to make one more crack at the year before it's gone. I've heard so many people say something like, I can't wait for this year to be over. I mean, have you heard that? Maybe 10,000 times? And just over and over repeatedly, 2020 cannot end soon enough. Well, guess what? In a few days, it will. And all of the things that you're so frustrated about 2020 will still be there. And it'll be a new year, and maybe, psychologically, we think in terms of changing opportunities and a clean slate. And I'm all for that. I'm all for making resolutions and so forth. But just not much is going to change in the next week or so. And so it'll be 2021. And as one fella said, when 20 turns 21, you just add alcohol. It could get worse. And things could get more frustrating. And then we'll be saying we can't wait for 2021 to end. And if we're not careful, soon enough we'll wish every year ended until before long our life has passed us by and we've just been sitting here waiting for it to change and making no changes in the area where we can. Every year, as we come to a close of a year, it is customary for people to look backward, for people to reflect on the year that's gone by, see what we can learn from it, see what's been good about it, what's been bad about it. This year, as people have been making lists and posting them as they always do about the best movies of 2020, the best teams of 2020. I saw one person comment, there's nothing good in 2020. And I think that is problematic if that's the way we see it. I want us to reflect on 2020 this morning. I want us to think about it, and I want to think about it with some godly perspective, because as people are looking back and they're thinking about the lessons, I think in large measure the world is taking all the wrong lessons. We're learning nothing. In so many ways, I think we're moving forward with even worse tendencies as a culture, as a society, than we began the year with. And what a shame that is. We need to apply God's word so that we can have clarity looking back and so that we can have clarity looking forward. Some people say hindsight is 2020. I'd say I'm glad to have hindsight on 2020. But I would say this, if we're not careful, we can look back with absolutely no more clarity than we look forward. And what a shame that would be. There are reasons why we might not have clarity looking back. There are more reasons why we might not have clarity looking forward. But when we learn nothing as we move through this life, there is greater culpability. And so while we may not have perfect vision looking backward, I hope that we have better vision. I hope that we gain more clarity as we move forward, because we are people who have the one element in our lives where there is total clarity. And it should help us be able to make an adjusted, a more appreciated view of what goes on in the world. I appreciate Chris reading from James chapter 4, and we'll begin there in James chapter 4. In preparing this lesson, I have whittled down and whittled down and whittled down. I started making a list of the lessons learned over the last year. And as I got to the third page, I thought, wait a minute, I don't have time for a series. And so I just kept trying to boil it down. What are the most important things we need to learn? What is, at least for me, and what's going to be the most helpful moving forward? And so here are just a few of the things looking back that I think are at least helpful to me to remember. And maybe the most important is this, and I am sorry about how that's showing up. That showed up much different on my computer, but we'll move forward. One of the most important things I think I have learned is the reiteration, the pressing home, the absolute exaggerated application of if the Lord wills. I don't think I have ever gone through a year where it has gone less according to plan. There is maybe, I don't think if you'd have told me at the beginning of the year, make out the most erratic year you can imagine, I would not have predicted anywhere close to the things that have happened. And not all of it's just because of a pandemic. So many other things have happened that have coincided with that. Amy and I were standing out at our property the other day, which we had no intention of buying at the beginning of the year. We're standing there becoming farmers of all things. And she said, "What an eventful year." And I said, "It is." And she goes, "I mean, just for us. Not to mention the rest of the world." And so in so many ways, we need this verse, these verses beginning in verse 13 of James chapter 4. You who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, and we will spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. It's an interesting passage. I think it's one of the things that's interesting is to try to figure out exactly what's going wrong here. And the boasting. Is it boasting to say, hey, this is what I'm planning to do tomorrow? Does it seem like boasting? It can be. In fact, if you just go throughout the scriptures, you will oftentimes find godly men expressing what their plans are, what they hope to do. And they don't always explicitly say, if the Lord wills. But I think that there's a particular attitude that goes along with these people. I think some of that is found here in the use of the word in verse 16. You're boasting. You boast in your arrogance. All such boasting, he says, is evil. And that's interesting because back in chapter 1 and in verse 9, he says that the brother of humble circumstances is to glory. And that word glory there is the same word as boast. He's to glory in his high position. And so here's a man who is engaging in the very sort of a thing that James in the same book says, all of that is wrong. Well, obviously, not all of it. Not all of it depending on what the boasting is on, right? What the basis of it is. And so in the one case, in chapter 1 and verse 9, the boasting is on the basis of what God has done for me. In chapter 4 and verse 13 and 14, the boasting is on the basis of what I will do. And so, of course, those are two very different things. It is the idea of exalting. It is the idea of expressing extreme confidence in something. And so I think about that. I think about that from my perspective at the beginning of the year till now. And what all we had planned. It was going to be a really eventful year for us. I don't know about for you. It was going to be for us. I was actually supposed to be gone the last 2 Sundays. We've been saving since 2015 to go to England and Paris and Prague and Vienna. And we had been, about this time last year, we were looking at airline tickets. We bought those airline tickets. Had a gospel meeting in Toronto. My kids were going to get to go to Canada for the first time. And we had big hopes on these things, right? We've been thinking about it and planning about it. We're really excited about it. And the more clear it became that those things weren't going to happen, well, disappointment sets in. How deep is the disappointment? Well, it depends on how much we were leaning on it. Was that going to make or break our year? Was that going to be the thing that made this year good or bad? I want to tell you, there are moments where I think that is exactly how we felt. That in some ways, I don't know that we boasted in the sense of like poking our chest out and walked around, but I think we boasted in our own minds and in our own hearts. This year is going to be awesome because, not because of what God's doing, but because what I'm going to do. And then we got to do none of it. And one dream after another just came crashing to the ground. And if I don't learn anything from that, then all we have is misery and disappointment and no value. But there's tremendous value. As I look at that, there's a tremendous value in me saying, hey, get it through your head, Stephen. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Deal with that. I think that truth has been beat into me. I hope it's something that maybe you've learned. Have you leaned too heavily and hopefully on your plans working out? Do you still have a mindset that if we just behaved in a certain way, we could finally get control of our circumstances? I think the world's still talking like that. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of people haven't learned this, that they think somehow if they do this or that or move forward in this way, then things will change. Who knows? I remember how confidently I said at the beginning of the year when we bought those tickets and things were just on the horizon, like there might be a problem. And somebody said, are you sure? I was like, by December, honestly. Okay. I'm not saying God specifically said to Stephen Russell, I'll show you, but maybe he said to the whole world, I'll show you. I don't know. I know right here he says it. And the circumstances have proved it true. You don't know what's coming. And so we need more reliance, more leaning on God when we talk about our plans, more exalting in what he has done and less exalting, less confidence based on what we will do. Another thing is that I believe and I am certain God's word that he wants my ultimate good. I know that's hard to see. All of you are squinting right now. I'll read it out for you. He wants my ultimate good, but it will come through present evil. Now, I worded that the way I meant to, that it will come through present evil. Not it might, it's possible, but that I believe it will. I don't necessarily believe that God is meticulously going through and working out miraculously every detail that's happening in life, but I do think that he is in total control and has total fiat power over everything that's going on. I believe that when I read Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, and I know there are varying views on this verse, some would restrict it to kind of a tight application of what's being talked about. More and more, I believe in the expansive view of this verse. And I think sometimes when I hear people push back against that expansive view, they don't make a case that sways me away from my conclusions here. It's a verse that you probably know well. We know that God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, some people read that and they read it much like delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you all the desires of your heart. They really lean on that he will give you all the desires of your heart and forget to really apply the delight yourself in the Lord part, right? That one hinges on the other. And I think that's the case here. All things work together for good. Yes, but for whom? It is on the basis of your love for God that things will work together for good. We were in a Bible class one time, and a fellow was teaching this, and one of the members of the audience said, "So you're saying that somebody breaking their leg can work for good?" And I was like, yeah, I mean, that's pretty easy to see how that could work. I could think of a number of different ways that could help somebody, and you could see. But it's like, for him, that was inconceivable how there could be any good come from some misfortune coming into somebody's life. And he listed a host of misfortunes. I was like, I actually know people who have gone through those things and have, and in fact, talked about the good that's come from all of that. Well, I think that not only do we have this verse, which we may or may not draw that conclusion from, but we have it in practice. So for instance, in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, you know that Joseph said to his brothers, there we go. That's what it's supposed to look like. You're a little bit closer. Joseph said to his brothers, you remember that they came up to him and they said, we don't have any confirmation of this. I think maybe they were fudging a little bit here, but they come up to him and they say, listen, I don't know if you know this, but Dad wanted us to tell you that you really need to let it go and that you need to treat us kindly. And you can almost hear their fear as you're reading through their sort of pleading with Joseph. And you, I'm sure, remember Joseph's response. Do not fear. You meant this for evil, but the Lord meant it for good. Now, that doesn't mean that it turns out they were pretty good guys. Hey, it turns out we did you a favor. No. You see, he starts out, you did mean it for evil. And there's a lot of things going on in this world that are evil. Incidentally, the word evil, as it's used in the Bible, means, on the one hand, bad intentions of people to do harm or to do what is, against God's will. But evil also references just circumstances. And so, as evil comes into our lives, whether it be circumstances or whether it be people actually with malicious intent, in either case, we see, as Joseph says here, that the Lord can mean that for good. And the Lord can accomplish great good. And I believe as we connect that to Romans 8:28, that is expansive. And so that no matter what I'm going through, I can lean on the confidence without seeing, without knowing, without being sure where that's headed. I can lean on the confidence God can bring good from this. And I need that. I need that truth. In 1 Peter chapter 3, we wonder sometimes about James chapter 4 and saying, if the Lord wills. I've even heard people sort of push back on that a little bit and saying, why wouldn't God will this or that? Of course it's God's will for this or that. But 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 17, it says, for it is better if God should will it so, that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. If God should will it so. I do not like to contemplate when life is difficult for me that God might want that to be there. But that is what Peter says is on the table. I hear people say in broad sweeping terms that suffering, that God never wants his people to suffer. Or it's almost like God is completely out of the picture. He's over here. And yes, the devil brings in suffering, but God has nothing to do with that. That's not what Peter says. Peter says that God might say, it's going to be good for you. And so, in a year like this, we need to allow that to settle in. That at the end of the year, I need to be able to say, This has been good for me, because if it hasn't, then what a waste. Then yes, then Satan is the only one who is pleased at the suffering. But God means for the suffering to bring you closer to him. He means for the suffering to make you more aware of him, to lean more on him, to draw near to the comforts of his word. And if all we've learned is how to gripe louder, then it's a waste. Then it is just wicked on the giving and the receiving end. But the receiving end can be a blessing. One more thing looking back, and that is, it becomes clearer and clearer that I do not know as much as I think I know, and neither do you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 1, now concerning things sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. I'm not talking about, I don't know, certain clear truths presented in God's word. I'm not saying that I don't know certain clear truths that are easily provable in the world. But there's just so much going on, and it is, at the end of the day, impossible for me to gain total certainty on any host of issues. And so I am left with finite resources in my mind and in the information that is available to me. And I am left with the wisdom of God's word to apply that to what information I do have and make the best decisions going forward. And let me tell you, this is the year of a whole lot of judgment calls for all of us. I tell you what I'm very thankful for. I have to make those judgment calls even with finite information. I've got to just take what I've got. I've got to assess what I can, and I've got to make decisions for me and for 4 other people that are under my particular care. And I have to say, I am so thankful in a year like this that pretty much my responsibilities end there for making decisions for other people. And I dare say that the people who have greater responsibility than that have had more weight on them this year than they probably ever signed up for intentionally. And they are being pushed and pulled and prodded in every single direction. And everybody who comes giving advice knows, and none of them really do. We all think, we suppose. Paul says over in chapter 4 and verse 4, beginning in verse 3, is a small thing that I may be examined by you or any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself, he says. For I am conscious of nothing against myself. Yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. Paul says, I'm not even certain right here. I'm certain you don't know. I'm not even certain I know all the things. I know God knows all the things. And I'll stop right there. And we need to stop right there. We need to be willing to make the decisions that we have to make and leave others within certain boundaries to make the decisions they have to make. Not too long ago, one of my daughters was asking for permission to do something, and I declined. And she brought up another dad who lets his kids do what I was not letting her do. I said, I know. He said, do you think he's a bad dad? Now, I have good daughters, but they're also lawyers. And I know what she was doing. And what her attempt was to get me to say one of two things. Well, the attempt was get the permission. That's the end goal, right? But the path to get there is to point over here and say, do you think this man is bad? And she knows I'm not going to say that because it's a man I have a lot of regard for. And I have regard for his children. And I think he's a good father. I think he's a great father. And so if he let his children do this, then either you need to say he's a bad dad or you need to do what you're doing differently. And I was willing to do neither of those things. He is a good father. She said, so was this a stupid decision? It's a decision I would not make. Still a good father. And I can give you a number of people that I have leaned on to come to the conclusion I'm coming to, who I also think are good fathers. And those things don't have to be mutually exclusive, right? Because we're talking about a judgment call. We're not saying it's a book, chapter, and verse issue that clearly right here it says you've got to do this. I'm compiling a case, and that case is full of incomplete data. And based on that, I'm making my decision. And he has made his. His decisions have worked out well. I believe mine will also. I think that we have been ripe for that sort of a thing. As churches make different decisions. We've got to decide who are the wise elders and who are the stupid ones. Maybe they've all got some wisdom. Maybe not all of them. Certainly there are elderships out there without wisdom. But even if our elders are making decisions where I would say, I wouldn't do that way. Let me just go one step further. They have made decisions where I've in fact told them I would not do it that way. I know you have too. But I've told them with the understanding that I don't have all the answers. I don't have the perfect solutions. And at the end of the day, God didn't tell me to make those decisions. Just like he didn't tell me to make the decisions for your kids. That's you. And you got to live with that. And I got to live with the decisions I make for my kids. And what I'm continuing to lean on, even when they make decisions that I would not make, is I'm leaning on the notion that I know that these are godly, wise men who are making the decisions on the basis of their wisdom and their knowledge of the scriptures. And I will continue to rely on them until they step outside those boundaries. Not because they're doing it the way I would do it. It's because we're not talking about some clear issue where obviously here's the answer. And if we think obviously here's the answer, I think what Paul wants us to see beginning in chapter 8 on an issue in which there is some clarity. It's not like there's no clarity, but he says, first of all, to the Corinthians, it's not as clear as you think it is. There's more at play here. You don't know all the consequences. And let me just say, the elders don't know all the consequences. Nobody knows all the consequences to all the decisions we're making. And they'll continue to revisit that, and so will we. But I hope that we do it with the knowledge that we don't have perfect knowledge. And so we're being called upon to rely on the very things that God has put in place. God put elderships in place. God put governing authorities in place. And I'm going to continue to move forward understanding that that is his plan for governance. I will submit to it. Somebody says, well, how far will you go? As far as I can. Absolutely as far as I can. What about looking forward then? Well, just a few things that I want to keep in mind based on what I hope we've learned from the previous year. I want to be more humble in 2021 than I have been in the previous year. Back over in James chapter 4, in James chapter 4. He wants them to learn the lessons of humility. And so as we back up a little bit from the section that we read there in verse 13, it is in the midst of an entire discussion about humility towards God and towards each other. He says back in verse 6, God is opposed to the proud but gives grace to the humble. Submit therefore to God. Verse 10, humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you. And then he applies that to other people. Do not speak against one another, brethren. He who speaks against another brother or judges his brother speaks against the law and judges the law. If you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge of it. Over in 1 Peter chapter 3, the word humility comes up over and over in this particular epistle. And he says there in 1 Peter chapter 3, to sum up in verse 8, all of you be harmonious and sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. There's got to be a whole lot less of that absolute certainty. Absolute certainty about what I'm going to do. Absolute certainty when we beat each other over the head with our opinions. Absolute certainty outside of God. That's what humility demands. It doesn't demand me saying, I don't know anything. It demands me saying, God is the only one who knows everything. Now, in that, I will be more certain of him and his word, less certain of me and my opinions. And that's how I need to approach people. Humility doesn't mean I never come to any conclusions and I never stand firm on anything. Last week, Trevor preached a lesson on homosexuality, and there are some people who might think that it's not humble to go and tell people. It isn't humble if Trevor got up and said, I just don't like this. It's very humble to say, this is what God says, and I will yield to it no matter what. And we got to make sure we understand that. This doesn't mean we get more timid about God's word. It means we lean more in the direction of God's word and less direction of, I think. Well, I'll tell you this. What does God say? And let's stop there more frequently and not go beyond and build our own cases, build our own morality. I think people are starting with good intentions. They're starting somewhere where God says, and then they build another piece on that and another piece on that. And they're 3 and 4 steps away. And like the Pharisees, they have built up a morality that goes well beyond God's word, thinking all the while that's the same as God's word. We've got to be real careful about that. And understand the farther away we get from what God has explicitly said, or even plainly implied, the farther away we get from that, the more humble we need to get in our presentation of that and our expectations for others to fall in line with that. So more humility is demanded. I don't think that's what the world has taken away from it. I think there's more rancor at the end of this year than at the beginning. How is that possible? Because people aren't paying attention. They're certainly not paying attention with God's perspective. But I want to walk away with that. I want to focus less on the circumstances and more on my reaction to the circumstances. In Philippians chapter 4, I think that's exactly what's happening in Philippi, is that they're looking around. They are frustrated by circumstances, and I don't know what all the specifics are, but it is causing them to have some rancor, to have disagreements. Specifically, 2 women are mentioned who are having trouble getting along, but it seems it's bled into the whole group. And one of the things Paul expresses to them is, hey, look at my joy. I'm in prison, and I am overflowing with joy. And so whatever you got going on, I think that you can learn to be more contented in those circumstances. Chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. Not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along in humble means. I know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That is a truth. And here I take the restrictive view of verse 13. I think he is particularly pointing to what he just said. I can go through anything. I can deal with any circumstance because I got Christ. I've had a lot of conversations this year where people have said in one way or another that they are just done. And I'm like, well, then what about tomorrow? Because I don't think you are done. I'm just so done with 2020. What if 2021 looks the same? Have you learned to be content in whatever circumstances you are? Oddly enough, going through poor circumstances can not just help you learn to be content, it can also help you learn to complain. And we've got that down pat. But I'm not sure that we've learned to accept in a godly way, accept with a godly attitude. I have heard people, I've lost count of how many times, and I've probably said it myself. I'm sure I've got a bad attitude about this, but I'm going to tell you, if my kids say that to me, I say, stop right there. I don't care what you're about to say next. You've already said the only part that you need to worry about. I'm sure I've got a bad attitude. Stop right there. Let's work on that. And so what you do when you say that, when you say, I'm sure I'm not thinking about this like I ought to, but, and then what you're doing is moving forward and you just brushed aside the most important part. You brushed aside the only part you'll be held accountable for, and you just went right on to focus on the part you can't do anything about. That is fruitless. And so more and more, I want to draw inward in a godly way and make sure all along the way, whatever this person does or these circumstances are, I want to be able to say, I'm trying to maintain a good attitude about this. And therefore, not I've got a bad attitude about this. Nevertheless, I'm going to go rant about the other person or the circumstances or whatever the case is. Because my heart's the one that I need to focus on when it comes to whatever's going on in life. And Paul is telling these people, he's telling these people, my circumstances are what they are. And here's where I stand. Here's where my heart stays. Here's where my attitude is. So how are you going to grow in this coming year? People made all sorts of plans that just went by the wayside this last year. My girls asked me not too long ago, are we still going on our trip this year? And I said, well, let me be very clear. I do not know. I don't know. Here's what I want to say for certain. I am determined to be closer to God at the end of this next year than I am at the beginning. I am determined to be more content at the end of this next year than I am at the beginning. I am determined to learn the lessons of God's word because I can do that no matter what happens in 2021. Isn't that a delightful thing? To know that, to be certain, to be confident that you can end the year better off than you started if your mind is focused in this direction. And so I hope that you make some determinations along those lines. Finally, I will keep praying for something different. Now that may seem at odds with everything I've just said, but it's not. Over in Luke chapter 18, and beginning in verse 1, Jesus gives us this parable, the parable of the unjust judge, or the parable of the persistent widow. But it is a parable in which there's a judge who does not fear God or respect man, he says, and there's a widow in that city. And she kept coming to him, it says in verse 3. She kept coming to him saying, give me legal protection from my opponent. And he is unwilling. And that goes on, and so does her persistence. And so he says, even though I do not fear God nor respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now, will not God bring you justice for his elect, bring about justice for his elect, who cry to him day and night? And will he delay long over them? I tell you that he will bring about justice for them quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, he will find faith on the earth. I don't think he means he will bring it about soon, but he will, when he does bring it, it will come, and with certainty and with swiftness. And so you keep praying. And the notion that we keep praying for something that we do not get is a difficult one. Alan stood up and said, our prayers worked. And I appreciate so much praying and then receiving and then having the joy of thanking God in the near term that we received what we wanted. But what if we'd all prayed and that went a different direction? There's so many things we've prayed for and have gone the direction we wanted them to, that we get unpracticed and poor at praying for the same thing over and over and over again and not getting it. And we think, maybe I just should stop praying for that. Maybe it seems clear God doesn't want that for me. And right here, God says, you don't know that. Just because I haven't done this doesn't mean that I don't want that for you. You keep praying for it even when I haven't shown up yet, and you do it with all the confidence that one day I will. And every day that you pray for it, you may think, why is this not the time? You don't know what you think you know. But he's God, and I have confidence in him. And I have confidence that ultimately, the ultimate thing that I'm praying for, I will get. Because the ultimate thing I'm praying for is for my good and for the good of everybody around me, most especially those who love God. And I know that will come. And I'll pray for it every day until it does. Because he says at the end of this parable, will he find faith on the earth? Who's faithful? The one who keeps asking. The one who keeps asking, knowing it's worth it. While the world is saying, why do you keep asking thoughts and prayers? Why do you keep doing that? It's obviously not doing any good. We buy into that. Then we'll be the ones that he doesn't find faithful here. Who will he find faithful? Not many, because most people will give up. Most people will buy into that notion that when you don't get what you're praying for, it means God's not there or he doesn't care about you. What a lie. And it's the lie that is being pressed harder and harder. And people are leaving the Lord under the impression that because they didn't get what they wanted, when they wanted it, he must not be there. Or even if he is there, he must not be worth leaning on. And the same people would lean on the wicked judges of this world with more confidence. And they would be more persistent in their begging of those judges than of the judge most high. And what a shame that is. Luke 22 and verse 42. This passage that Matt brought up in his talk this morning before the Lord's Supper. Jesus in his prayer, it says, he said, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. I'll tell you, I'm praying specifically. I'm praying for the virus to go away. I'm praying for political unrest to go away. I'm praying for corruption and abuse of power to go away. And I am praying that if any of those things continue to be God's will, he will help me deal with it. You say, how could they be God's will? In the same way that putting his own son on a cross and watching him bloodied and beaten die there could be his will. It could be. Help me accept it. That's what Jesus is saying. I don't want to go through this. Is there another way? Could there be another way? Is it possible? It's not likely, but I'll pray for it anyway. But at the end of the day, help me accept it. Help me accept you and whatever comes with accepting you. That's what I want. And so that is my prayer. At the bottom of my prayer, at the foundation of my prayer, your will be done. That's at the foundation of Jesus' prayer. Here, it's the foundation of his model prayer. Thy kingdom come, your will be done. Can I just suggest when he prays, thy kingdom come, he knew what it meant. And so even there, your will be done. That's what I want. Well, we need to be learning and growing every year. But we especially need to learn and grow in this sort of a year. We want to learn not just any lessons, but we want to learn the right lessons. The world has its takeaways from this year. Many of them are not very helpful. In fact, I think in some instances, people have learned the very opposite lessons that they needed to. So many people are looking for a better year in the next week or so. Yours can be. You can guarantee that you have a better year this coming year than the previous. But it'll be a better year regardless of the circumstances. And it'll be one that comes because you make choices and because those choices begin with a determination to serve God. With a determination to be one to whom Romans 8:28 applies, one who loves the Lord. That's how it'll all work out together for your good. And if you have not made that determination, if you have not called on the name of the Lord, rendering obedience to him, yielding entirely to him, and you need to make that proclamation this morning, there would be no better way to start out the new year. And it would be a better year for it. If there's any way we can help you with that, when you come while we stand and while we sing.